Hi, I'm Brent Hirose, and this is episode 0 of the Super Nintendo Chronicles. The Super Nintendo. There's a theory among Doctor Who fans that whichever incarnation of the character the viewer grows up with will forever be their Doctor. And so it is for me in the Super Nintendo, forever my gaming console. While I did have an original NES growing up, I still remember selling it, with the help of my parents through a newspaper classified ads of all things, in order to buy my first console upgrade. The SNES stayed with me throughout years of gaming, well into the 32-bit era, and started my game collection, which now numbers in the thousands. I never sold my original SNES, and I doubt I ever will. In this series, I'll be exploring the games of the SNES, from beginning to end, joining the ranks of other chronological series like Nintendo and Game Boy World. Along with discussing the historical significance and legacy of these games, I'll also share personal anecdotes, and hopefully be able to contextualize these games for people who never experienced them for themselves. But before we get into any of that, what's a Super Nintendo? The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, aka Super NES, Super Nintendo, SNES, or SNES, is the follow-up to Nintendo's massively popular NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System. Much like the NES is the North American version of the Japanese Famicom console, the SNES is the US equivalent of the Super Famicom. Unlike the Famicom/NES, the SNES is very similar to the Super Famicom, with a boxier casing and purple and gray color scheme, versus the gray with a hint of the rainbow that the Super Famicom offers. However, other than those cosmetic differences, the systems are largely the same. In fact, only a few physical tabs prevent one from inserting a Super Famicom cartridge into an SNES. Remove them, and you're region locked no more. Let's flash back to the late 80s. Nintendo has revitalized the console market with the NES, sending the industry into a massive boom after the crash caused by the fall of Atari. Video games are a huge business, and everyone wants to get in. While the NES itself isn't a particularly impressive machine, its cartridge format allows game makers to insert special chips and additional RAM into later generation cartridges, which greatly expand what is possible in an NES game, improving the way games look and sound, something which will continue on into the next generation. Still, no amount of technical wizardry can prevent the inevitable. The NES is getting outdated. In October of 1987, Hudson Soft and NEC released the PC Engine in Japan, which was then released in North America on August 29, 1989, under the name TurboGrafx 16, so named for its 16-bit processor. This is actually stretching the truth. The CPU is actually 8-bit, much like the NES, but has a 16-bit graphic processing unit, which allows it to feature much more impressive visuals. In 1988, Sega followed by releasing the Mega Drive, which, in 1989, was released in North America as the Sega Genesis. Here, we have a true 16-bit system, and its ports of Sega arcade games blow away anything the NES can manage. Graphically, at least. With its jet black exterior and a partnership with Electronic Arts bringing a full line of sports titles onto the system, the Genesis quickly distinguished itself as being a more adult system. Then, with the launch of Sonic the Hedgehog in June of 1991, and a more aggressive, teenage-focused marketing campaign, the Genesis truly takes off, and Sega suddenly becomes the leader of its generation. At first, Nintendo was in no rush to join its 16-bit adversaries, as the NES was still quite successful in those early days. However, as market share began to slip, the rush to release the SNES became more urgent, and on Wednesday, November 21st of 1990, the Super Famicom was launched in Japan. Only 2 games are ready for the initial launch, but it becomes a huge success anyway, selling out the initial shipment in mere hours. By the time the Super Nintendo launches in North America on August 23rd of 1991, there is a more respectable lineup. At launch, the SNES is technically impressive over the competition, although not entirely superior. The much older Genesis has a faster CPU, but the SNES has a lot of bells and whistles to make up for that. Its graphics processing unit has a total of 32,768 colors to choose from, compared to the palette of 512 available on the TurboGrafx and the Genesis. More importantly, it also included 7 graphical modes, the most famous of which being Mode 7. which allowed for a variety of scaling and rotating effects, which would become the hallmark of the system. The sound chip on the system was a Sony SPC700, which allowed 8 sound channels in 16-bit stereo. As later ports of SNES games to systems like the Game Boy Advance would prove, this chip produced excellent sound that was difficult to emulate on other hardware. At the time, it was the best music you could get on a home console. More than the initial hardware, the Super Nintendo offered additional innovation with its controller. While the TurboGrafx produced a controller very similar to the original NES, and the Genesis increased the button count from 2 to 3, the SNES went all out with 4 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons, along with Start, Select, and the D-pad. No analog sticks, but if you want to know where Starfire Saga Laser Ion 5 got its start, this was definitely the step in that direction. Seriously, this controller allowed for more complex control options, and along with it, more complex games. While it'd be a lie to say that everyone figured out what to do with all these extra buttons right away, the modern controller owes a lot to the humble SNES. The Super Nintendo fought long and hard, eventually overtaking the Genesis and becoming the best-selling console of its generation, with a worldwide total of 49.1 million systems sold, about 9 million more than the Genesis. In that time, it featured a host of excellent titles, launched a golden age of Japanese role-playing games, and of course, featured a slew of licensed crap that I'll have to suffer through. You're welcome. Today, the SNES is beloved by retro game collectors, and many of its top titles are available for purchase on Virtual Console. As we go throughout this series, we'll take occasional stops to look at exclusives that were available in Japan and Europe, but mainly are going to be concentrating on the North American games, and we'll be following that through the order that the games were released, as best as myself and the internet can determine. I invite you to hit up a local flea market or used game store, or to drop a few bucks on the Nintendo eShop as we explore the software that made the SNES great, and the memories that made it my system. Check out SNESchronicles.tumblr.com for details on the project, blog posts, and more, or just click subscribe to find out when a new episode is released. See you next time.